On the night of November 19th, 2012, many escapers braced as the combat system was about to change forever. The evolution of combat was here. Since that fateful night, we've had a multitude of changes, and as the decade comes to a close, I thought it was a great time to recap what has changed with the best in slot gear over the years. This first video is going to be focused on the melee combat style, with range and magic to follow in their own specific videos. Strap in, this is going to be a fun one. Because we are starting this video at EOC launch, we need to give ourselves a baseline of what the best in slot actually was when EOC first launched. With EOC, they moved into a tierscape system where generally the highest level items were the best item, and there was a lot less nuance as to what the best items were. In terms of weapons, we have chaotic longswords and its offhand chaotic counterpart, and then a chaotic maul for two-handed abilities. It should be noted that chaotic rapiers also existed, and they dealt the same amount of damage as the longswords and were used whenever a monster had a stab weakness. In terms of armor, the full Torva set accompanied all 5 slots as there were no alternatives yet, while the completionist cape was our best in slot cape as it gave HP, armor, and damage bonus. For jewelry, we had the Cinderbane's Whisper, which was a rare necklace drop from Cinderbane God Wars, and the imbued Warrior's Ring. It's interesting to note that the Warrior's Ring was useless in the pre-EOC meta because the Berserker's Ring was that much better with its strength bonus. But in EOC, the Berserker's Ring became the Hybrid Ring, and it was always better to specialize in a specific style. In terms of familiar, there were 2 main ones that people used, Pack Yak and Steel Titan. The Pack Yak was used for extra inventory on bosses and Slayer monsters to last longer and also be able to teleport items to the bank, while the Steel Titan was used where the extra inventory wasn't needed and you needed to do more damage quickly. While I don't want to cover every single switch that has come out because we don't have 18 hours to burn, I do want to mention some of the more important ones, and on release of EOC there was only one switch worth talking about, and that's the Ring of Vigor. It saves 10% adrenaline on ultimate, so that means when you used your Berserk ability, you were already closer to 50% adrenaline to be able to use your powerful threshold abilities. The extra damage was always worth the inventory slot. Not even a month into EOC and we have our first major update. On December 11, 2012, player-owned ports entered the game. This was essentially the sailing skill, but in minigame form instead of skill form. With this update came a new equipment slot, the pocket slot, and to fill those slots we were given a ton of new items called scrimshaws. There are 2 that affected melee combat, the superior scrimshaw of attack and the superior scrimshaw of vampirism. The attack scrimshaw gave you additional accuracy, while the vampirism scrimshaw healed you while you did damage. Most people settled on the extra healing being the best one to have, as it allowed you to eat less and last longer at bosses. In the early days of EOC, Jagex pumped out a lot of bosses very quickly to help flex the new combat system and get people interested in using abilities. The first one came in January of 2013, Kalphite King. Kalphite King drops a total of 6 Drygors, 3 main hands, and 3 offhands. They fall into the categories of Mace, Rapier, and Longsword. The Mace was best used for General Slayer and PVM as it had a +9 prayer bonus, while the Rapier was best used for a stab weakness and the Longsword for a slash weakness. This was the first T90 weapon in the game, and as melee was the only style to have a T90 weapon at the time, it was considerably better than all of the other styles. 2 months later, we get the World Wakes quest. While this didn't have a major impact to the gear for the melee combat style, it still provided a couple of new general abilities. Natural Instinct is an ultimate ability where you gain double adrenaline for 20 seconds after using it. To this day, this ability is still used in some rotations where you need to do a lot of burst damage. The other 2 abilities, Guthic's Blessing and Balanced Strike, were not very useful to the melee combat style, as the adrenaline cost was not worth the damage or healing that could be done with them. April of 2013 gave us what I like to call EOC 2.0. This is the point where Jagex created the 3 armor classes that we have today. Power armor is essentially the DPS armor. You trade in less armor stats for being able to do more damage. Tank armor is the armor you would wear to soak up the most damage and give you the most HP. And hybrid armor is the armor that you would wear with any style when you want to use multiple things, like for example at Dagonoth Kings. But with the ability to use multiple styles, you have a large armor reduction penalty and no damage bonus. The decisions made in April of 2013 are still rearing to this day, as power armor has dominated the meta. The defensive penalty for using power armor over tank armor is pretty much meaningless, as the best way to take less damage is to kill the monster quicker. The Monastery of Ascension and Virago came out in the middle of 2013, giving T90 weapons to both range and mage, leveling out the combat triangle. To round out the end of 2013, Rise of the Six came out. This was quote-unquote hard mode Barrows, and for its time it was an extremely inventive boss. The rewards were plentiful for melee, giving us both new T90 power armor and a T90 shield. The T90 power armor was special as it degraded to dust, so that meant every approximately 30 hours of combat you had to buy a new set. This left a ton of players unwilling to upgrade to the T90 armor and instead stuck with their cheaper to repair Torva, though Malevolent armor was clearly the new best in slot. To round out what was an exciting year for RS combat, the Slayer monster Hydrix were released in December. They dropped a new T90 glove, and much like their Malevolent counterparts, they also degraded to dust. This left people in a similar situation where they sometimes couldn't justify paying the extra GP for the small benefit over Torva gloves. Speaking of Torva, only one item, the boots, are left on the best in slot gear setup. I wonder how long they'll last. Fast forward to May of 2014 and we have a minor update. Ancient Combat. It comes with two things. First of all, the Codex Ultimatus. This unlocked the 4 tendril abilities, each one linked to one of the ancient spells. The melee ability was Blood Tendrils, which was a powerful bleed ability that hit both the user and the target. This ability immediately made it into DPS rotations. Second of all, Nihils were released and you were able to kill Nihils, and they would drop components which could be turned into summoning pouches. And you could summon Nihils as a familiar. These familiars, which were bound to each of the ancient spells, gave the player a 5% accuracy buff when using the correct style. For melee, that was the Blood Nihil pouch, as it kind of goes along with the Blood Tendrils. This familiar was used whenever accuracy was a big issue, a common occurrence at high-level bosses like Virago, Rise of the Six, and Calphite King. The very next week, don't need to wait that long, we got a new best in slot item. In the Dungeoneering Reward Shop update, they provided new rewards, one of which was a Chaotic Remnant, which could be combined with the previously best in slot necklace, the Saradomin's Whisper, to create the Brawler's Knockout Necklace. June of 2014 had arguably the most important update to RuneScape in the post-EOC era, the Legacy update. While its naming convention and the extra combat mode was mostly an attempt to get the players that had quit to come back to the game, the mechanics of what changed made EOC what it is today. On the high level, the stuff is back to the 138 combat formula. Special attacks are back, so weapons like Dragon Daggers and Dragon Claws can now be used as special weapons, costing adrenaline. Style bonus replaced critical hit chance buff, and base HP increased to 100 times Constitution level instead of the 40 times it currently was. There were also some background balance changes that were much needed to make the combat feel better, but the biggest one is the style bonus change. While the critical hit buff and strength bonus leads to similar DPS increases, it feels so much better to hit higher than to hit the same number more often. If you go back and watch any pre-Legacy Update EOC content, you'll see similar numbers pop up all the time, and it's just plain boring and feels like you have little impact on the damage you're doing. From now on, I'll be doing my best to reference the style bonus of the item when we get upgrades for non-weapons, as it's a very obvious way to see how much better something is. Rounding up the T90 weapons, Raxxor came in July 2014. This boss was tough on release and had all the makings of the great RuneScape boss. One of the items dropped by Raxxor is the Raxi Fang, which can be combined with a spider leg to create the Noxious Scythe. This is a T90 two-handed melee weapon. It also had the advantage of being classified as a halberd weapon, meaning that you could hit enemies from 2 tiles away. On release, it wasn't the most popular weapon, as the AoE melee abilities were not that good until a year later in the summer of 2015, when they changed how the abilities Cleave, Hurricane, and Quake work. And for single targets, it was much better to just use the cheaper and more damaging Drygores. Soul Reaper is one of my favorite updates of the past 7 years. It creates a purpose for killing lower level bosses, creates a way for players to make money, it introduces new gear into the game that was game changing, and most of all, it was fun to do our daily Reaper tasks. With this update, there were 4 new pieces of jewelry added. The Amulet of Souls was the best all-around amulet, as it had a plus 46.3 style bonus, which is plus 2.2 higher than the previous best in slot Brawler's Knockout Necklace. On top of that, it also had 2 special effects, which can be normalized down to a 20% damage reduction while using protection pairs, and an 18.75% healing increase while using Soul Split. Very powerful effects. There was a second, more niche necklace called the Reaper's Necklace, which provided a plus 3% hit chance boost, but it only had a style bonus of plus 36.8 and didn't have all the other special effects that the Amulet of Souls does. This meant that most people mained the Amulet of Souls and only used the Reaper Necklace when they really needed the hit chance buff at a place like Virago. The other 2 Hydrix items, Death Touch Bracelet and Ring of Death, both immediately became best in slot. The Death Touch Bracelet has the ability to reflect some damage taken back to the monster attacking you, and the Ring of Death has a chance to give you adrenaline when killing a creature. On top of that, there were newly implemented death costs where you had to pay GP for your death based on the items you had on you when you died. For people with high death costs, they could instead use a Ring of Death and it would lose 15% charge and save you from 1 death. It should be noted that hydrix jewelry was originally degrade to dust, but after a couple weeks they made them repairable with onyxes, which made them more affordable to use. The Ring of Death's time at the top was pretty short-lived, as the very next update we want to talk about is Broken Home. This was the Halloween event from 2014 and it came with a permanent quest. Once you completed the quest, you could replay the quest and try to complete challenges within it, and if you completed all of them, you would get the Asylum Surgeon Ring. The ring had a plus 21% style bonus, which was 4.2 lower than the Ring of Death, but its special effect more than made up for it. It has a 10% chance to save the adrenaline cost on using a threshold ability, and it has a 40% chance to save 25% of the adrenaline cost of a special attack. Both those things add more damage if you know what to do with the extra adrenaline than using the Ring of Death. Now it's time for the first of our patch notes update. On November 3rd, 2014, Dominion Tower gloves were made good again. They now exist in the glove slot and act as T80 gloves. On top of that, they have a special effect where basic abilities can do more damage. These gloves would last for 4 hours of combat and then degrade. They were widely considered best in slot whenever the monster you were fighting was reflect immune, as that meant that the Death Touch Bracelet's special effect did not work. Now we move on to the most minor upgrade you will see in this entire video. The second batch of Elf City in the fall of 2014 gave us the Tier 1 task set, and with that was a valuable item we can put in the ammo slot for the very first time. It gives you +1 prayer bonus for each level of the task set complete, with having the elite task done being +4. At least it's something. Fast forward 6 months and not much has changed for our melee boy here, but with the Rune Dragon update we have something to talk about. The Emberkeen boots were made by combining 2 Rune Dragon drops with the Glacier boot, and they were now the best in slot melee boots. However, like other T90 armor, they fell victim to the degrade to dust mechanic. These boots cost over 50 mil, lasted about 30 hours, and only provided plus 1.8 style bonus over the Torva boots. They were aptly named Dice Boots, as only the people with nothing to do with their money would use these boots. Jagex' attempt to make Slayer a little more interactive with tough but rewarding Slayer creatures in the month of November 2015 led to our beloved Pack Yak being replaced. There was a new and better Beast of Burden familiar, the Pack Mammoth. It had 32 slots instead of 30 that the Yak had, and it was able to eat food directly from its inventory without losing adrenaline. Though expensive, it quickly became a staple at new and long boss fights where its bonuses over the Yak would show up. Invention changes everything. Well, not everything, but a lot of things. It allowed us to augment our items, meaning that anything that wasn't augmentable immediately became less worthwhile. This hit the T90 armors hard as they were degrade to dust, and Jagex hadn't prepared a way to have them still degrade to dust but also be augmentable at the same time, so they just couldn't be augmented on release. This meant that Torva reclaimed its old spot as the best in slot melee armor for at least the plate body and the plate legs. With Invention came the ability to add perks to our armor, weapons, and shield. On release, the best perks were for the weapon, you wanted to have Precise 5 and Equilibrium 3. For armor, you wanted to have Crackling 3 and Mobile together, Impatient 3 as its own gizmo, Devoted 3, and Biting 3. And then on your shield, you wanted to have Turtling 3 to get an even longer barricade. While some rare niche combo perks did exist, without a perk calculator, it was very difficult to discern whether a combination was worth going for or not, so the majority stayed with the base perks that were very easy to get. The Invention update also opened up avenues now that new bosses necessarily don't need to drop new best in slot, but instead can drop new items that can be disassembled into new components, and then those perks can now be added to our gear. And we got just that with the release of God Wars Dungeon 2 2 months later. God Wars Dungeon 2 had a total of 4 bosses on release, and they each gave us a cool new perk. The Twin Furies gave lunging components which made bleeds deal more damage. This became an immediate switch, and most people put it on an offhand Dragor to reduce cost. Hellweir gave planted feet components which made damage boosting ultimates last 25% longer. This worked with Berserk up until January of 2017, where they changed the ability and you no longer could get an extra long Zerk with it, which is unfortunate because it was really cool to get like a 25-second Zerk. Gregorovich gave us Karoman components, which make AoE abilities like Chain and Ricochet hit additional targets. This perk had no impact on melee, as Chain and Ricochet are not melee abilities. Vindicta gave us aftershock components, which deals damage to your target in an AoE fashion every time you deal 50,000 damage. This was immediately good enough that it replaced Equilibrium 3, but not wanting to lose out on the effect of Equilibrium, it was discovered that you could combine Precise and Equilibrium into the same gizmo and get Precise 4 Equilibrium 2. So instead of our Precise 5 Equilibrium 3 setup we had before, we now had Precise 4 Equilibrium 2 and Aftershock 3. Torva's time at the top was much quicker this time, as later on in June of 2016, Jagex released the ability to augment T90 armors, which means that Malevolent is now the best in slot melee armor again. It's still degraded to dust, but you had to re-augment every time you bought a new set, keeping that sort of degraded to dust thought alive. And that is the last time we'll see a next item on this list, which is kind of sad, because those were such iconic armors for our time. Later on in June of 2016, it was a momentous moment for RS3. We finally broached the T90 tier and moved into T92, and it all started with Telos, the next of God Wars Dungeon 2. Its fun streaking mechanic and rage pushing made for an interesting and constantly changing challenge for the players, and they were rewarded with 3 different T92 weapons. We mostly care about the melee 2-hand weapon, the Zeros Godsword. Not only is it the best in slot 2-hand melee weapon, but it also is an extremely powerful special that will be used long after the ZGS is eclipsed by other weapons. The Black Hole special attack is basically a mini Sunshine in the fact that you deal 25% more damage while inside the Black Hole. This is commonly used in the time between berserks, as you have about 40 seconds to use thresholds and build back up to 100% to use berserk again. In the fall of 2016, we were given 2 more new Invention perks. Faceted Components gave us Enhanced Devoted 3. This takes up both perk slots on the gizmo, but it acts as a 25% damage reduction when using protection prayers. This replaced the Devoted 3 gizmo we had previously, which only provided an 18% damage reduction when using those same protection prayers. Clockwork Components gave us the Flanking perk. It made stuns very powerful when used behind the boss, as a threshold stun could do up to 290% ability damage with Flanking 3 on your weapon, though you did lose the stunning nature of the ability. As it was a perk that only affected one ability, it was commonly used to switch on another offhand Draugr while at group bosses, and the tank would force the boss to be faced away from you so you could hit it from behind. 2017 was a big year for RS3 power creep on both the financial side of the game and the DPS side, and it started quickly with Next Angel of Death coming out on January 30th. The boss dropped T92 dual-wield magic weapons, but we don't care about that. We care about the Praisal Codex. This unlocked a new, more powerful damage-boosting prayer that would replace Turmoil. Turmoil represented a 10% increase to damage accuracy and levels, while Malevolence, the new prayer, represented a 12% increase to damage accuracy and levels. When the math was done, it was about a 4% increase in damage, which for RS3 is a large amount of power creep. Shortly thereafter, in February, Skill Cape perks were released, meaning that when you equipped a Skill Cape, it gave you some sort of effect for using it. But Jagex realized that Skill Cape stats were too low in comparison for anyone to actually use them, so if you were maxed or comped, you could add 3 Skill Capes to your cape and get the effects of all 3 at once. For the meleeer, only one was a must-have, and that was the Strength Cape. It made Dismember last 3 hits longer than it normally did, making it the best basic to use for average damage when not Zerk. For the other 2 slots, it was common to put in the Defense Cape for free signs of life and the HP Cape to allow you to heal at the bank while staying in combat. Coming in June, the Menaphos update was the newly introduced Sigil slot. This was basically a second pocket slot item, but the idea was that it would be an active that you would have to choose when you want the effect to happen, instead of a passive that most pocket slot items are. It had a lot of potential, but the sigils were deemed too expensive to use at a majority of the content, and was only used at the top bosses. The best sigil on release was the Limitless sigil, which allows you to use thresholds below 50% adrenaline, meaning that when you ultimate without an adrenaline pot, you can still do a similar rotation as if you had an adrenaline pot to drink. Eventually, the sigil slot was removed, and the sigils were turned into abilities that didn't consume charges, but were more expensive to make. I thought this was a great decision, as it went from a niche top-level item to something everyone can try to unlock and work towards. At this point, it's a theme that there's a new boss every summer, and 2017 didn't miss out on that. We got Magister. Magister was the spiritual successor to Legions, as it had the same idea of having to pay an entry fee for each fight. Keys to the Crossing were dropped by the new 99 to 120 Slayer mobs, and each one gave you one battle with the Magister. The reward? Kopeshes, the new T92 dual-wield melee weapon. The T92 weapon set was now complete for melee, as we had the Zeros Godsword to cover off the two-handed abilities. All we needed was the armor. The Lost Grove is arguably the best looking place in RS3, and it set a beautiful stage for the future boss Solak. But for now, it was home to 3 Slayer creatures only: Moss Golems, Bulbous Crawlers, and Vine Crawlers. They dropped a new hybrid glove that was very, very, very powerful: Cinderbane gloves. They had the base offensive stats of Bandos, Armadillo, and Subjugation gloves combined, so you got a 11 style bonus in each style. They also had a special effect that heavily increased the amount of damage that you could deal with poison. They immediately became the best in slot gloves at places where monsters could take poison, and their low repair cost made them worth it even on something like mid-level Slayer. It seems weird to get a new best in slot item for clues, but that's exactly what happened with the release of Master Clues in February of 2018. Master Clues gave us Soul and Reaper ornament kits, which increased the stats of amulets by +2 on the style bonus. A very small upgrade, but when it's permanent, players will pay for it. I really like this update as it gave life to clues beyond getting super rare dies or fortunate components, which were always the same price. Just a little bit more variety. The Lost Grove was complete in the spring of 2018 when Solak came out. This was the spiritual successor to Next Angel of Death, as it was Mod Ramen's second attempt at a big boss fight. On release, it didn't have a big impact on melee, but the Raxxor's Grimoire was buffed on July 30th of 2018, and it became a must-have item for melee immediately. It has 2 special effects when activated. First of all, it gives a +12% critical chance buff. This essentially is like a 6 to 7% DPS increase to match the ability of Scrimshaws right there. On top of that, it also increases the maximum hit on criticals to 15k instead of the 12k that it was. This makes the Grimoire especially big for melee because the damage boosting ultimate Berserk gives a 100% damage increase, meaning that high hitting thresholds would commonly hit the 12k cap, losing out on a lot of potential damage. This means that you can now hit 13, 14, 15k with your assault or flanking while you're berserked. Not even a month later, the Dragonkin Laboratory came out. It's an elite dungeon consisting of 3 bosses, each dropping an ability codex. These codexes affect 3 melee abilities, and they had a major impact on the PvM meta at the time. I think if we're going to take anything in this list, maybe Archaeology and Invention rate higher than the impact they have on the PvM melee meta, but third place is definitely the Dragonkin Laboratory. Starting with Fury, instead of being a slow channeled ability, it instead provided the damage of the first 2 hits immediately and had the special ability that if Fury crit, then the next ability you use would also crit. This was really fun to use, as when you got that Fury crit, you knew that your next ability was going to be good, so you could use a big damaging ability. Flurry, the second ability, was very bad without the codex. It was a dual-wield AoE ability, but if you ever wanted to AoE with melee, you would just use a 2-handed weapon instead. The codex boosts the damage of Flurry if you only have 1 target, so it becomes a suitable threshold to use now while bossing. If you cancel it as soon as possible after 3 ticks, you get 2 hits of 154%, which is as good as a deep stun with flanking, well worth the 15% adrenaline to use. It became a threshold in most melee DPS rotations. Barge was the biggest game changer we've had for melee. Melee long had the problem that if you had to deal with boss mechanics, especially ones that require you to move far away from the target, making you unable to attack, and that's where Greater Barge comes in. If you haven't hit anything for 4.8 seconds and you barge your target, then you get a buff where the next channeled ability you use is dealt as a bleed over time, meaning that you can use Assault in one ability, and instead of waiting for all the hits to go through, you could activate your next ability when the global cooldown was up. On top of that, Barge increases in damage the more you haven't attacked, meaning that you can start most boss fights with a very big hit, as it's been a while since you've hit anything. If you're berserked, you can even hit over 12k. Overall, the Dragonkin Laboratory made melee so much stronger, and at this point it's the best style in the game. It's around this time that death costs started to get out of control, and if you weren't wearing a Ring of Death, you were paying 2 to 3 mil GP per death, and it was only going to get up as more switches and better gear was added. So at this time, the majority of PVMers switched back to camping a Ring of Death and only putting on the Asylum Surgeon's Ring when they wanted a threshold, or for most people, not even at all, and just left it in the bank. To push melee over the edge, they needed to get T92 melee armor, and we got just that in January of 2019. The mining and smithing rework came out, and the reward was custom fit trim masterwork armor. Boy, that's a mouthful. I'm just going to call it trim masterwork from now on. Trim masterwork is the T92 melee power armor. It combines both a bunch of skilling with bars and ores and a bunch of PVM drops with Torva and Malevolent to create a monstrosity of an armor set. Not only does it have the best stats in the game for melee armor, but it also has a special effect where up to half of the damage dealt to you is dealt as a bleed over time instead of in one hit. This means that a 10k hit can be spaced out as a 5k hit and then 3 1.6k hits. This made it much easier to tank boss mechanics and just DPS through them and eat through the bleed when you need to. Even without the special effect, it would be best in slot, and 4 out of the 5 pieces of the armor set were immediately best in slot, with the Cinderbanes being the proud gloves that still kept their best in slot. With this update, we actually have a useful ammo slot item to talk about, armor spikes. These damage your opponent under a set strict of conditions, and the damage you deal is equal to your smithing level. To deal damage when they hit you, you need the following: wielding a melee weapon, wielding melee armor in the top and leg slot, and being in melee distance away from the enemy. This meant that if you were using a Noxious Scythe and you were 2 scores away, despite having the melee weapon and the melee armor on, you wouldn't deal damage. These work both in the inventory and equip slot, but it's best to just wield them and take the extra inventory slot for an extra piece of food or prayer potion. Follow up on that, 4 months later, they added alloy armor spikes, which are more costly and take slightly longer to make. They have a 10% chance to deal 10 times damage with the spikes, so over a large period of time it works out to double damage for the regular spikes, and a worthy upgrade. June of 2019 was a tough time for PVMers as they removed the Reaper requirement from the completionist cape. At the same time, Jagex stripped away all of the perks on the cape, making it purely cosmetic, as it probably should have been from inception. And the benefits that were originally attached to the cape were now usable with any cape once you had unlocked that special. For example, maxing used to give you 3 skill cape perks, so if you're maxed, you would now have access to 3 skill cape perks regardless of which cape you had equipped. This meant that any cape could now be the best in slot cape, but the one with the best stats was the melee kiln cape, Takar Kalket. This is a pretty old piece of content, so if there's one equipment slot where I want Jagex to focus on for 2021, it's the cape slot. 3 new best in slot capes from God Wars Dungeon 3 would be so cool. As mentioned earlier, the sigil slot was only a temporary thing, and it was officially removed on August 19, 2019. This made all sigils now an unlockable ability, which made for some good power creep, but it moved the item from a niche top level item to something all PVMers can go for. The 120 Herblore update in the fall of 2019 brought about 2 new potions that are viable for melee. First up, we have vulnerability bombs, and while this seems small, it's actually major. Vulnerability was often something that was only used with the magic style, and it gives you 10% extra damage, so it's very powerful. Vulnerability was a big part about making magic good as a style, and now that every style had access to it, it started the decline of the magic style. The second potion is a simple Herblore upgrade. Stats were now boosted to 120 when using Elder Overloads over Supreme Overloads, so it became the go-to overload now. Archaeology is a doozy, delayed but eventually out in March of 2020. I could probably make a video alone about all the power creep in this skill, but let's go through rapid fire because this video is already too long. First of all, Ripper Demons replace the Steel Titan as a DPS familiar. You deal more damage as your opponent loses HP, meaning that the tough end parts of a fight you have more damage at your disposal. They were nerfed about a month after release for being too strong, but they are still way better than a Steel Titan. The Trim Masterwork Spear of Annihilation came out, which is a cheaper T92 two-handed melee weapon, though it lacks the special attack of the Zeros Godsword. What makes it special is that it has an ability where all bleeds last 50% longer. This means that Dismember, Slaughter, and Blood Tendrils are even better when switching to this weapon. People threw out their old lunging switch and made sure to put it on the new spear. It also became the best in slot weapon at Corp and made it possible to fully AFK the boss. Self-plug, I have a AFK guide on it. Next up, we have the relic system, which was introduced with Archaeology, and by the time you reach 99 Archaeology, you can get 500 relic power. This allowed the use of different relics, but the 2 that stood out are Berserker's Fury and Fury of the Small. Berserker's Fury makes you deal more damage the lower your HP is, much like how the Durok's Barrow set works. Fury of the Small gives 1% more adrenaline on every basic ability used, making it quicker to get to ultimates and threshold. And last but certainly not least, Ancient Invention came out, which changed the landscape of perks. Better combinations were possible, and the highest rank for perks went up by 1. So Precise could now go to 6, and Aftershock could now go to 4. Here's a list of all the best in slot perks. There are 2 new perks from the Archaeology update, and they both made it onto the best in slot list right away. There's more small things within the skill, but those are the main talking points when it comes to the main Archaeology update as it relates to melee. As the pandemic worsened throughout 2020, there was a lull in updates, and the next meta-changing one came in August with the Essence of Finality release. The Essence of Finality combined the powers of the Amulet of Souls and the Reaper Necklace together, granting both effects at the same time. No more deciding between a higher hit chance and a better survivability. On top of that, it had plus 9.7 style bonus over the old Amulet of Souls. To top it off, it had an ability where you could use a weapon on it, and then it stores the special attack of that weapon inside the amulet, which you can then use as an ability. This revitalized old content, as suddenly you could do a Dragonclaw special attack with a T92 weapon, making them viable in DPS rotations. The 3 main ones to know for melee are Dragon Dagger, Dragon Claws, and Statius Warhammer. Dragon Dagger is best used when you have excess adrenaline, as it gives the best ratio of damage to adrenaline usage among the Dragon spec weapons. Though once you have all the gear and abilities, your adrenaline need is so high that you rarely have a chance to use it, but until you get a Zeros God Sword, Dragon Dagger can be a good spec for you. Dragon Claws are best used when you get a Relentless proc and have a free Berserk. If you use Claws immediately after barging, you can revert to a similar DPS rotation that you would normally have with an Adrenaline pot after Berserk, but you get a free D-Claw spec out of it. And last but not least, the Statius Warhammer massively reduces the defense and armor of the target you're attacking, making you hit more accurately, and when used, you'll be hitting most bosses at 100% accuracy. By placing a hammer in the necklace, you end up getting unlimited special attacks, so there is no longer cost using the hammer. Before this update, it costs 300k per special attack, so using the hammer added up quickly, and this has saved PVMers so much money over the past 6 months. Raxxor was the final update of 2020, and while it's a fun boss, its impact on melee was pretty minimal. The only change I made to my melee setup post Raxxor is that I now have enhanced laceration boots in the boot slot. They have slightly lower damage than the trim masterwork boots at 0.5 less style bonus, but the quality of life of being able to bladed dive around with two-handed melee is worth the minuscule DPS difference. And with that, we've run to the end of 2020 and the end of Melee's progression. We've gone from T80 to T92 and a bunch of other auxiliary items that made this video way too long. I put a lot of effort into this video. I think if you exclude gameplay time, this is the video that took me the longest to make. So if you want to see the other 2 styles, make sure to leave a like and a comment down below. Past that, have a good day, and I'll catch you in the next one.